want to begin on this last Sunday of our summer sermon series. I would like to begin with a little story. Once there was a farmer who had a farm on a particularly windswept coast near the Atlantic Ocean. When the storms rolled in off of the ocean, when the wind blew, it could be absolutely brutal. And as a result, the farmer always had a difficult time keeping hired hands around the farm to help him out. They simply didn't want to put up with the trouble and indeed sometimes the danger of what it meant to work on this man's farm. Then one day, a short, wiry man showed up for an interview. The farmer asked him if he was willing to work hard. And the man said, "Well, I can sleep when the wind blows." It's a strange kind of way to answer, but the farmer was desperate, and so he decided to roll the dice and take his luck, and he hired that man. Well, as the next days and weeks went by, the farmer couldn't have been more pleased. He indeed was a hard worker. He worked from sun up until sundown. He did all the tasks that the farmer asked him to accomplish and more. And the farmer ended up being very pleased indeed that he had found such a hard worker. Then one night, the wind began to howl, and the farmer sat bolt upright in bed. He knew exactly what was coming. And so he jumped up, he ran down to the quarters where the farmhand stayed, and he rapped as hard as he could on the door trying to wake the man up. No response. So he let himself into the cottage and he went back to the bedroom where the hired hand was sleeping. And he shook him awake and said, get up. We have to get ready. We have to tie everything down. There is a storm coming." "No, sir," the hired hand said to him. "I told you, I can sleep when the wind blows." Well, the farmer was furious. But nothing he could do got the man out of bed. And so he left himself, he ran out of the farmhand's quarters, and he went to take care of all of the tasks that needed to happen. But much to his surprise, he found that everything was already prepared. The cows were put into the barn, the chickens were fastened in their coops, all of the shutters of the farm buildings and the house had been closed and latched. The farmhand had done it all ahead of time. All of a sudden, the farmer then remembered his words, and they held a new meaning. I can sleep when the wind blows. He could sleep because everything was prepared. He could sleep because he was ready. Semper paratus, always ready. That is the motto of the United States Coast Guard. We would all do well to adopt it as a personal motto for our lives too. As Benjamin Franklin once said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. This final sermon in our summer series focuses on a parable. It's one of those parables that Jesus tells to describe what the kingdom of heaven will be like. Except in this particular parable, it's more like what the beginning of the kingdom of heaven will be like. Jesus says that it will be like 10 virgins or bridesmaids who took their lamps one evening and went out to wait for the bridegroom. The biblical scholar N.T. Wright calls them 5 sensible virgins and 5 silly virgins. The 5 sensible girls are like that Coast Guard motto. They're prepared. They realize that the bridegroom's arrival might be delayed, and so they take along extra oil for their lamps. The silly bridesmaids can't be bothered with that kind of preparation, and so they don't take along any extra oil at all. They are, like Ben Franklin said, failing to prepare and therefore preparing to fail. The bridegroom does indeed get delayed, and as a result, all 10 of the bridesmaids fall asleep. And then when they are least expecting it, the big moment arrives. The cry goes out, "Here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." And at that point, The consequences of being sensible or being silly play out in short order. The sensible bridesmaids wake up, they trim their wicks, they get ready to go out and join the celebration. The silly ones try to make up for their lack of preparation by begging some of the oil from the sensible bridesmaids. But the sensible bridesmaids will have none of it. If we give you our oil, they say, then all of us are going to run out and no one is going to have a light. Go out then and buy some more oil for yourselves. The silly bridesmaids try to do that. But by the time they get back, the banquet is on and the door is shut. Lord, Lord, they say, open the door for us. Then the reply comes out, I don't even know who you are. And Jesus concludes the parable by saying, therefore, keep watch, because you know neither the day nor the hour. That's tough stuff. Jesus is pretty straightforwardly telling us what he's talking about here. He's talking about the second coming. He's talking about the end times, the end of days. The fancy word that we sometimes use to describe it is apocalypse. Now let's look at that for just a second, because we're venturing into territory that can be a little bit scary for people. Just that word, apocalypse, sounds scary, doesn't it? When you read parts of the Bible that are apocalyptic in tone, they can just blow your mind. There's all this talk of things that are going to happen, and there are all these symbols that clearly stand for something, only you're not always sure what it is that they stand for. Then, of course, there's the way that Jesus himself talks about all of it. In a number of parables, people end up getting tossed into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is the phrase that is used more than once. Not a pretty phrase. This isn't exactly the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, that we are used to. And then, of course, we have this parable here that we heard about today, about the 10 virgins and the bridegroom. When the foolish virgins show up late, they are just flat out rejected and left out in the cold. So I know that it's probably the case that things apocalyptic are scary, but here's my question. Do they have to be? Let's look at the word itself, apocalypse. It looks a little bit exotic. It sounds a little bit exotic. There are a lot of words in the Bible or in Christian theology that are that way, and it's often because they come from Greek roots. They come from a language that is much different than our own, and it lends them a certain kind of exotic flavor. They're spelled funny, and they sound a little bit funny to our ears. But in the case of the word apocalypse, it is simply a word that means uncovering or revealing. It means to make things plain or to lay things bare. In fact, it's why the final book of the Bible is called the book of Revelation. A revelation is something that has been uncovered. A revelation is something that has been explained. It's something that has been, well, the word itself. It is something that's been revealed. If you go to the King James Version of the Bible, you'll see that that same book is sometimes called not Revelation, but rather the Apocalypse or the Apocalypse to John. Whereas in more modern translations, we've gotten rid of that difficult sounding word and we simply call it Revelation. But either way, whether you call it the Apocalypse to John or the Revelation to John, the meaning is actually the same. The last book of the Bible is simply about uncovering God's plan for the fulfillment of his kingdom. If we think of it that way, then what my hope is that talking about the end times or talking about the second coming or talking about the apocalypse, it doesn't have to be scary at all. It just is. It's just a plain fact. It is something that is coming. And any information that God gives us about it is intended to be for our benefit. God isn't giving us information about the second coming or about the apocalypse in order to frighten us, but rather for our benefit. There's no need to fear. That information is given to us, as Jesus says, so that we can be ready, so that we can keep watch, so that we can make sure that we are awake when it finally arrives. During this entire period of the pandemic, which is now, well, it's 5 months old, there have been certain inflection points. Think about what these points have been. There was the point in the middle of March when everything began to shut down. I tend to connect things with the church because I spend an awful lot of my time here at the church. But at the same time that the church was shutting down its worship services, except for the live stream, and the time that we started asking people to stop coming for Bible studies and for various different kinds of gatherings. There were businesses all over the place, all over the country, that were shutting down as well. That was the first major inflection point. Another one came about 6 weeks to 2 months later when things began to open back up again. But at that inflection point, we also began to realize that we were in things for the long haul. And so some of the things that we see everywhere now, like mask wearing, began to be ubiquitous at that time. Now it feels like we are at another inflection point. We're at the end of the summer. And for many families, my family included, families that have small children who are getting ready to go back to school, there is another kind of an anxiety or another kind of a pause that we're taking because we're not sure what that's going to be like when our children that we've been able to keep safe at home over the past 5 months are once again sent into our schools so that they can receive their education. There is a great deal of anxiety going on. Have you felt it? Of course, there have been some absurdities along these inflection points and some humor with those too. Think about that point last spring when you went to the grocery store for the first time and you realized that it was literally impossible to buy toilet paper. You want to talk about a moment of anxiety. I don't know about you, but for me, there was definitely an uh-oh aspect to that moment. No, I thought. My family needs toilet paper. We're not ready for society to fall apart quite yet. I felt like I was caught off guard. And that's the thing about all these inflection points that we've experienced over the course of the pandemic. Every time we get to one, we have this kind of no feeling. This feeling like, I'm not ready for that. I wasn't ready for the grocery store to be out of toilet paper last spring. A lot of families aren't ready for the anxiety that comes along with their children going back to school now. What Jesus is trying to do in this parable is to help us from getting caught spiritually off guard. He wants us to be prepared. Always prepared. He wants us to be prepared for eventualities that we cannot predict. In the same way that over the past 5 months, we have encountered a lot of things that there was no possible way we could have predicted beforehand. There is an apocalypse coming, Jesus wants us to know. But he also wants us to understand what that apocalypse is really about. And that is that there is an uncovering, that there is a revealing coming. There is a way in which things are going to be shown for us. The apocalypse does not have to be a disaster for us. It can actually be the best news that we ever encounter. The main point about it, Jesus says, is that we're just not going to be able to predict when it comes, and therefore we need to be ready. There's another point about this that I think it's important to note, and it's one that I've always grappled with myself. It's one that I've always struggled with. And that is the way in which we can get caught up thinking about the second coming. We can get caught up thinking about the end times. We can get caught up trying to make our own predictions about it, when in fact Jesus says that such predictions are ultimately futile and in vain. And yet, friends, there is another kind of apocalypse that is coming to each and every one of us that we can do a lot better job predicting. And that is the apocalypse that we will all encounter when we pass from this earth, for those of us who do pass from this earth before the big apocalypse comes at the end. What I'm talking about, of course, here is our own deaths. And that's something that we need to think about too. The fact of the matter is, there is a little apocalypse that's coming for each one of us. There is a little revealing or a little uncovering that is going to happen when we all go to meet Jesus. And we will, in fact, go to meet Jesus, even if we do so before Jesus comes back to meet us and to bring his kingdom in its fullness. We need to be ready for that. We need to be ready for that event no less than we need to be ready for the end of days. For the end of our days is going to be an uncovering for us. It's going to be an apocalypse in the sense that there will be things that will be revealed to us when we meet the Lord face to face. If this pandemic has shown us nothing else, it has reminded us of the uncertainty of life. When all of our modern conveniences and all of modern technology start to lull us into a state of complacency and self-confidence, along comes something like the coronavirus to remind us that in the end, we really don't have control of anything outside of ourselves. We don't. But we do still have control of things inside of ourselves. We don't have control over external events, but we do have control over our own readiness and over our own preparation. I have been thinking about a lot of the sermons of this series that we have preached over the past couple of months, both those that I have preached and also those that Pastor Danny, Pastor Jen, and Pastor Todd have preached. And as I've gone back and looked at those, one of the things that has been brought home to me is the way in which so much of our messages, whether we intended for them to or not, so much of our messages are geared to try to get our congregation and all of those who would participate in this service to get spiritually equipped for the living of these days, to get our lives right with Jesus, to embrace the spiritual disciplines and the means of grace, to rededicate ourselves to our Christian walk in a time when coming into the church and being together is more difficult than it's ever been in our own lifetimes. A lot of that is about being ready. A lot of that is about being equipped. A lot about that is about getting prepared. And I think it's appropriate. We don't know the day or the hour, as Jesus himself tells us, but we don't have to be afraid of that. And I want you to hear me say that. We don't have to be afraid. We only have to be ready. And we can leave the rest in Jesus' hands. So keep watch, or stay awake, or be ready. We don't know when the end will come. We don't know when our end will come. But we do know that Jesus will be there waiting on us. And that is the best news of all. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.